Okay, everyone. I'm really excited to host the first panel of today. And as you might see from the so as you might see from the slide behind me, the panelists are going to be speaking about how generative AI has and will continue to impact, as well as perhaps even transform, three very important aspects of clinical practice. Firstly, we've got medical education, then basic science, and then, of course, clinical practice itself. So my name's Annie. I'll introduce myself later, though. I think it's more important that we all have a general understanding of what is generative AI. So at a very high level, I think we can say that it is a way that computers can become creative. This was something that was, normally that only humans can do. And now it's computers that are being able to generate new things. Generate, for instance, new text, new reports, new summaries, new, let's say, even poems, new structures, new proteins, new drugs. And we can even go further and say it can create new diagnoses, new treatment plans, new diagnosticians. And even if we can go so far as to say new doctors. We don't know where it's going, but we do know that it's going fast. And sometimes it has been developing quite ungracefully as well. We know that there's been a lot of disruption, and it is a disruptive technology. For instance, we've heard recently about the protests in Hollywood that have almost put the whole film industry to a standstill, where actors were fighting for the copyright of their own faces. But on the other hand, it's been very inspiring. We see that it's also been participating in some of the most transformative and important global health problems, such as creating new antibiotics. So where do we stand? It's created this enormous potential, but it's not all of us that are normally interacting and making new antibiotics every day. We are normally interacting with generative AI in a more basic and mundane way through ChatGPT. But the doctors in the audience here, I think, will really appreciate that access to information, especially access to accessible information in this conversational format, and at the right time in the right place, it can really be completely transformative. It can save lives. And when it's just a click away and it's just a URL or a website away, this can be transformative and life-saving at scale. So that puts us all in this room in a very nice position, because it allows us to access this really transformative technology, and it can allow us to foster its potential. So it's the role of this panel here today to guide us to how to use this appropriately. And I think that it will be quite an exciting and a kind of relaxed discussion. So we really want to encourage you to think about questions throughout. And it's an hour long. We'll be going through those three things that we had spoken about before, which is firstly medical education, then basic sciences, then clinical practice. And at the end, where you start hearing me speaking about clinical practice, you can already start thinking about your questions and coming up to the mics. And we will probably be bleeding also into the coffee break just afterwards. So we know that we are separating you from the coffee break. So we expect some really cranky questions and some nice controversial ones as well. So please feel welcome to make them as interesting as possible. And so let's get started. I'll quickly introduce myself and then we can get started properly. So just for me, my name's Annie. More officially, it's Annie Hartley. I'm an assistant professor in Biomedical Informatics and Data Science, and I have a research group there called the Laboratory for Intelligent Global Health Technologies. So I use generative AI all the time, and specifically adapting it to low resource settings, as well as humanitarian response. I'm also a medical doctor and working also mostly in a volunteer capacity in my free time, but in low resource settings. And so I'm very excited to start. I think we turn our attention now to the panelists. And the first question is an easy one. Please, we'll start from there to here. Introduce yourselves in a sentence.
I think I've already spoken enough this morning, so people already know me. I'm Rohan Khera, though. I'm a cardiologist. I lead the cardiovascular data science lab, and I'm a member of the Biomedical Informatics and Data Science faculty as well. I work in artificial intelligence and medical technologies for cardiovascular care, especially around disease diagnosis and quality improvement. Thank you.
I'm Hua Xu, professor at the Biomedical Informatics and Data Science. I primarily working on natural language processing in the medical domain. So we develop algorithms and the software to understand the biomedical text, like patient notes, biomedical literature. In the past year, I would say we spent almost 90% effort all on working on large language models for medical applications. We will have some presentation and posters later in the session. Thank you.
I am Mark Gerstein. I worked in this field of, I guess, computational biology or biomedical data science for many years. I'm very excited by it. I mostly focus on analyzing molecular data, that's sequences and structures, but I've also looked a bit at sensor data, images, and text.
Right. So I think just before we start, I try to give an example of, what generative AI is, but I think everyone would like to hear it from you as well. So I think I'll start with Mark, as you've got the mic in front of you. Can you try to give us an explanation of what generative AI is in your own words, but also how does it differ from regular AI? Yeah.
Sure. Well, regular AI, I would say, is, in the past usually had to do with predicting something. You would sort of have a question and it would sort of answer it for you. Generative AI, as Annie's described, really comes up with new things. It generates new ideas, new structures, new texts, and so forth. And that's a really amazing and powerful thing. I should say, though, that this is a new phenomenon, but people have been using computers for many years to, for instance, generate text or things like that, just not as successfully as of late. So I think this is a very new and promising development.
We'll go to Hua next, if you can. Yeah.
Add a little bit more because we just actually had this online short course. I teach a lecture over there about this generative AI, how it's different from the previous AI. So in addition to what Mark just said about the focus on generating content, I think there's a couple of other things might be worth thinking about. One is really the previous AI task is more on a specific task, but now those new generative models become very generalizable. It almost can handle all the different tasks. And in terms of a data format, if I think all of you work on data science, a lot of times deep learning, machine learning technology often rely on pretty much structured data to build a model. But here, if you think about how ChatGPT works, it's more taking user-friendly input-output. So what that means, like an average person can really use those AI technologies rather than you have to know Python to formulate the data before you can build a model. I think that's also a big distinguishing between the current technology and the previous technology. Of course, other things include those days, those generative AI model is very complex with hundreds of billion parameters, and you have to run on very large GPU cluster, right? Rather than previously smaller models. I'll stop here just to see.
I can't add much more. I would just say that for synthesis, for folks who are like maybe not as aware of what the general AI is, it's about pattern recognition in complex data. That's always been at the core of AI and being flexible in that prediction. What generative AI did additionally was that idea of pattern recognition was made at the core itself, but and a foundational principle of generative AI is filling out missing pieces of information in that data. And that's been done with text, that's been done with images. And then when the model learns to fill in the gaps, it starts to generate information from nothing. And that, I think, is the core principle of generative AI that changes, that differentiates it from AI that did not have such generative components, even though it was using similar model architectures, similar computational platforms.
Yeah, I think that that's a really nice 3 different kinds of perspectives on that. And I think that we can go a bit further and ask you how then you use the technology in your daily lives. We can go back to Mark if you like, some interesting ways that you are using it, and also in your research if you like, as you prefer.
Sure. Well, I've certainly used ChatGPT, as I'm sure everyone here has as well. And I've used it to help with writing, but also with coding. And, there's many tools, and I think we're going to be talking a lot about the coding dimension today. Since my lab is interested in, obviously, molecular sequences and structures, we've also used it in that context. It's a little bit of a different context. And as I'll say later, I think really impressive to see a structure generated or some, physical object. And so we've used it in those domains and are very excited about it.
Yeah, I think we use a lot of those large language models, and that's basically our main research on the NLP. But I just want to describe one of my early experience with ChatGPT, which actually is related to the search committee activity at the BITS, because we're recruiting a lot of faculty, and we also need to write a lot of rejection letters. So at the early time, we trying to come up draft about rejection letter, but I asked ChatGPT to try it. And all of us, I think, on the search committee agree ChatGPT did the best job drafting the letter. Start with a thank you, and also explain how competitive it is. And then you're not selected because of priorities on the research area and all those things. Then wish you the best, and hopefully cross the paths again in the future. So it's really very nicely articulated the letter. We all like it. Yeah.
I would add here, actually, there has been studies on this, right? It has tried to be formalized, and ChatGPT has got the enormous advantage of time, right? If you want to be empathetic, it's a time-based process. So they've done this in AI for medicine as well, right? And they tried to compare humans with ChatGPT, and this was GPT 3.5, not even the newest one. And in a blinded study, it was like way outperforming. You just need time. It takes time to say, well, we regretted to inform you. So it's so true. Yeah. And how about you, Rohan?
I mean, I think there's of course like transformative aspects to my personal academic and personal life. I think I am able to program at a pace. I started programming exclusively when I became faculty through my fellowship, and a time comes when you're writing grants nonstop, and it just becomes impossible to keep up with it. So I've been able to go back to programming because I know exactly what I need. I can get some core code and keep coding. So I think that was a very I think got me back into doing more work hands-on, which I love doing. So that was great. And then I think, we've been creative, not with just novel methods, but deploying them for, reading ECGs, like taking ECG photos and turning them into reports and things like that. Those kind of applications that, instinctively come only from generative models. We've tried to do that. And one of our lab members, Akshay Kunta, is going to present about that. And then thinking about how to deploy information extracted from one domain, and Phyllis is going to talk about taking it to a different domain. How do we cross-domain learn? And that kind of stuff is just exceptional, and physically could not be done before this era.
Okay, keep the mic, because that raises some interesting questions for medical education, right? Because the things that you're saying there, you're making these tools that are basically allowing doctors to do a lot of shortcuts, right? It's allowing us to automate the interpretation of ECGs, automate the interpretation of echocardiograms, of so many different things, right? So what are you teaching them? Are we now making them lazy? Are we making them lazy? And
I think it's a response rather than a cause.
Yeah.
And I say that mostly because, the current medical training and practice is very challenging. It's time consuming, especially in low resource settings where the lack of, we think about in a very micro environment, we've got expert cardiologists roaming around. You can call them up and say, you know what, I can't read this ECG. Can you please read it for me? Happens in emergency medicine. We're colleagues, we can do that. My dad practices in a setting in India where he has to see 60, 70 patients a day, doesn't have a cardiologist on call, and the ability to have some level of higher order skill to bounce off with adequate controls, with parameters on how it works. That's where our goal as researchers come in. I think there is going to be this synergistic value to medical education that will expand the capacity of our capacity to deliver expert level care in settings where it was not physically possible before.
Okay, and I'm going to open up, just because we have the time and it seems like it's quite easy to do. If anyone appears at the microphones, we'll just take your question, right? So please appear, and then we'll take it. And there we go. Let's go for it.
Hi, my name is Samit Mehta. I'm a bioinformatician at the Yale Center for Genome Analysis Bioinformatics core. I have not used ChatGPT. I just kind of explored when ChatGPT 3.5 came out. But I do feel that every time I hear about ChatGPT, it seems that it is only useful to people who are already experts. If ChatGPT gives something that is a hallucination, unless you are an expert, you are not going to know whether the output is useful. it might give you a useful output. It might even work. The code might work. But if you don't know how it is actually working, you are kind of de-skilling yourself. You might get ahead 1 time, 2 times, but eventually you are going to stumble. And I don't know whether there is a solution to this problem.
Yeah, and I'll put that in some words, terminology, a great question. Terminology that we then like to use about this is like skill atrophy or cognitive atrophy. And also very important to kind of appreciate the role of how much confidence you have in something, right? So I put that to anyone in the panel who wants to answer. I think we've got Mark here who would like to go for it.
Yeah, I would say, don't know where you went, but there you are. I think that one of the interesting things with ChatGPT and the generative AI is to really contrast the situation you have with sort of normal English text versus a detailed scientific thing. With normal English text, you ask it to generate it, you can read the text and you can understand right away, did it do a good job or not? And did it just speed up things? And I do think that is very different from a detailed technical setting where it spits something out and you don't really know whether it's right or not. And I do think that is a very different situation to be in, and I agree with you. And I do think what we're going to have to do more and more in a technical capacity is not so much be always generators, but also be very good editors and be able to look at something and appraise it.
I would just like to add, maybe someone can add also the potential of like prompt engineering and how we can maybe also help make controllable systems to, does anyone have something to say about that maybe? Have you had some experience with engineering your prompts to make sure that you get the output you're looking for?
I think a prompt is definitely important. If you really, basically prompt is you're trying to teach the model, what do you want, right? You want to let the model understand the goal for this conversation. In addition to prompt engineering to address the hallucination problem you mentioned, like Mark said, for general English, pretty much you can read it. You say if it actually express what you want to express. But on other kind of factuality kind of statement, for example, when we start using ChatGPT, it often output fake citations. Looks very real, but you search it in PubMed, no such paper. So then we actually, for example, there's a lot of work going on trying to augment those existing knowledge base together with those large language model. One is to fix the wrong information. The other one is also to update with the most recent information. For example, ChatGPT might be built before 2020, right? How about recent information? So there's a lot of things going on. For example, we are working on a project which is trying to exactly check the citations out of ChatGPT by argument with PubMed database, trying to find the very relevant true citations and then replace what the fake one generated by ChatGPT.
So I really like that as well. Like this is in technical terms, we can call it retrieval augmented generation, where we're trying to like get the best of both worlds, right? We're trying to have the generative creative part of it, but we're also trying to have some extractive. So it's the two worlds of being extractive from like a Google search that we're used to being abstractive and creative in what we're trying to search within the model that we have. And if we can put those two worlds together, we can have the creativity that's also supported with evidence, right? So we'll go to the next question. We have some time.
I don't have any training in AI or computers. I apologize if my questions are very simplistic and basic. First off, thank you so much for hosting this. You guys are my hero. Thank you so much for Metatron Llama 70. However, I find that sometimes it doesn't give me accurate results. I do find that modifying system context prompting is helpful. So my two simple questions. The first one is, other than retrieval augmented generation, fine-tuning foundational models using tools such as low-rank adaptations, etc., how do we minimize hallucinations to zero, especially when I'm dealing with high context length?
Okay, so if we put it in another way as well, that was a great question. So for people who don't know, Meditron is a model that's made in our lab for medical question answering, very high stakes game, right? Very high stake game. You don't want to hallucinate. How can you go to zero? I'll post this to the panel, and I will add a little nuance to say, are humans at zero? Yeah, so please.
I mean, I think if I understood the question correctly, the idea is like, one, how do you learn across very large domains of text where like you're learning, not only your information is not captured in one paragraph, right? It's available throughout the pieces of text, and you need to aggregate that information meaningfully and ensuring that we're still accurate. I feel the key way where, you know, the RAG or the retrieval augmented generation is useful is the ability to say that you need to cite information when you give me a piece of information. So, you know, you would never imagine this world moving so rapidly. A year ago, we had GPT 3.5, where it was hallucinating like crazy. And now even ChatGPT works with Bing search engine, verifies its pieces of information, often provides you citation. So I think whatever challenges we see right now will be solved in much shorter time than any other challenge in technology or others have been solved before. So I actually feel like let's tabulate our needs and our wants, and I think they will be improved either by us as a community AI researchers or those that develop them at the industrial scale.
And I really like the question, and I'm going to expand it a little bit, because how do we improve it, right? How do we go down to zero? We must remember also that we have got, this is machine learning. So can any of you please tell us about how these big tools are actually learning right now in context, not just with prompt engineering, but maybe some DPO and RLHF, maybe you can say what those horrible acronyms mean. Yeah.
I can talk a little bit. Actually, later on, we have a lightning talk on how to fine-tune those large language models to improve the clinical application. So I think the question, if I understand correct, is really how you can improve the zero-shot performance of those models. And there's two types of models, right? Right now, one is closed source commercial model, ChatGPT, Gemini. You don't know how those model works. To further improve the performance for your specific task, typically one is we just talked about retrieval argument generation models. Okay, using other knowledge build models outside of the ChatGPT and the argument. Now ChatGPT also provide fine-tune using your own data. For ChatGPT 3.5, I think it has a function as you pay the money and supply the data, but the model still will be hosted on the OpenAI. You are not getting the model by yourself. So that's for commercialized model to fine-tune or improve it. For open source model, for example, we are working a lot on Llama. Then you can do all the things to improve it. Typically, two steps. One is if you have the large GPU capacity, you can do continuously pre-train. You give them a lot of medical data together with the data from general domain, continuous pre-train pre-train the large language model, basically. Second step is fine-tune. Instruction tuning is one of those approach. You can give a lot of, for example, question-answer pair, and then can fine-tune the pre-trained model, further improve the performance.
I really like that answer, and I'm going to give a shameless plug. In 2 weeks or so, I'll be speaking about this process for Meditron that you mentioned earlier, where we are continuing to pre-train and then also fine-tune. But how do we make it go down to zero? We make sure that we can ensure that the data that's going in is something that we want to abstract from. If you go and train it on like Moby Dick, then your diagnostic, solutions and treatment plans are going to involve harpooning whales, and is that a hallucination? No, it's not, because this is what you've expected to make it answer. So if you train it with information that's high quality, that's also very important. So it goes in this thing as well. In about 2 weeks, I'll do the BID Symposium. I forget what it's called, seminar series. Please come. So I'm going to go through one question from our side, because I really want to finish with this question about making clinicians lazy, skill atrophy as well, cognitive atrophy. Has it changed the way that you evaluate these skills in your clinical residents, for example, now that we can automate some of these things? Like, do you like drill them with the ECG questions, or do you just go, oh, don't worry, the ChatGPT will?
I think if I may take that as the token clinician on the panel. So I would point out that, you know, this is still not integrated in our clinical practice as yet. I mean, most of the tools are research grade, so we're not using any of these skills yet. But I think it brings up even a bigger challenge in training. We don't have to go back to the old ways of doing. I mean, we moved from manually doing stuff to getting calculators in our like daily practice. And it was okay. We survived. And I think the same is going to happen with AI. We're going to build a newer computational tool that does something for you. And then your goal now is to verify. You are now, our medical training has to evolve to now train our clinicians to be Bayesian thinkers, to be better Bayesian thinkers than they were before, even more so, because now they will have this automated information. And there's this phenomenon called automation bias. Whenever you get a computer to suggest you something, even if it's completely wrong, you're likely to think maybe it's right and maybe I'm wrong. And that idea of automation bias has to be drilled away from our, subconscious thinking. So I think our medical training will evolve. We will train better experts, as to Mark's point, who are better editors, better reviewers, who can actually understand the inputs that go in and the outputs that come out and judge the uncertainty that comes in each domain.
It's a very good point. I don't know the last time that I've like double checked my calculator and done some long division or something. So I think it's automation bias is very important. I want to extend the question. Then I'm sorry I'm making you wait, but like just make it just one more question because it kind of flows. Because it's the skills of clinical skills, but it's also I think more for Mark and Hua, who are teaching more biomedical informatics and coding. Your coding is so easy now, right? I mean it's so much of the hard work can be done by ChatGPT and co-pilots and all this. So how do you value the skill of coding now, and how do you teach it? Let's start with Mark. Yeah.
Sure. Well, definitely, I think ChatGPT and Copilot are going to revolutionize how people code. I mean, I think very much like the calculator revolutionized how we do arithmetic, or GPS revolutionized how we look at maps. And, I do think that's a good thing. I think people are going to be thinking more about the architecture and the overall solution and not about as much about the syntax and actually coding things. And I think that's a good thing. But, as an educator, I do worry that, people will get so far removed from the underlying thing that they will lose understanding. And, I think people think about this all the times in terms of what has the calculator done to learning about arithmetic. I mean, kids just don't know how to divide anymore, right? What has the word processor done in terms of just handwriting? People can't handwrite anymore. And, I do think that we should worry about this skill atrophy thing very much. And I think it's very important with younger people to say, even if you could do it with ChatGPT or you could do it with the calculator, you still have to do it by yourself once just to understand it.
I really agree. I would say that, creativity, like it's a field that wasn't really being encroached on before, and it is a practice skill. And if you get shortcuts, are we becoming less creative? But rather going back to the coding question, how do you like evaluate it and value it in general?
I actually don't really teach coding classes, but I do a lot of software development. So my conversation with even experienced developers, I think with the Copilot or something, the coding functions from the ChatGPT probably improve about 30 to 40% of their coding efficiency. So that's quite a lot. And another experience I had is I felt like now with those large language models, a lot of AI application became much easier to develop. I was talking to a friend who's on the industry side. Last summer, August, they have an idea about recording physician-patient conversation and automatic generates notes for primary physician setting. And we were just talking about this last August, but I was talking to him last month. Their application already online for a couple of months and with hundreds of physicians using it. So the majorly two components. One is the Whisper, also from OpenAI to record the voice, then OpenAI do the summarization.
It's really exciting. I love that because it kind of just opens up the topic that we'll discuss later, but we'll first take these questions about the democratization of the technology. Before we had, like just the computer scientists who know nothing about medicine making these tools, and now we actually have it from the other direction as well. And I think the democratization of the technology, sure, it might make some laziness on one side, but it actually opens up a lot of skills when you're coming from the other direction, right? So I think that's very interesting. I want to just maybe go back to your question.
Yeah, so my second question, and maybe we can take this offline, but for fun, I like to transform text to embeddings and store them on a vector database. I was wondering if you had any resources for optimizing similarity search algos. And the second thing is, my thought was transformer architecture. Is there anything in the pipeline at Yale for higher efficiency without fidelity loss? And any plans for sparse MLEs for Metatron?
Oh, I missed that last one. Sorry. Anything?
Sparse mixture of experts.
Sparse mix. Okay. I'll let anyone answer on the table.
I didn't really hear very clearly about the question. Sorry.
Okay.
So the first one was
infrastructure. Can I summarize? Infrastructure investment within Yale to do similarity mapping on transformer-based embeddings, and then transformer-based model infrastructure architecture development at Yale. And then the third is something around Metatron and mixture of experts.
Okay. Yes. Now I just needed more time to process. I have it. I think we've got it. Who wants to take the first one? Mark?
I'll just say one thing. I mean, I do think one big issue I think people have alluded to in terms of dealing with the transformer model and a lot of these big models that we really have to confront as academics is, this requires serious amount of computers, tremendous numbers of GPUs, tremendous amount of training. And a lot of this is really beyond what we can do in academia. I think much more so than a lot of the things were in the past. And, I think that this starts to get us to think a lot about, how do we interface, with industry? How do we interface with the commercial world and also with, I guess, the big tech world and so forth, and something to think about.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. Actually, in the lightning talk, Dr. Chen, she will present the Mi-Llama model, which we trained specific for medical domain, similar to Metatron. You train the 70 billion model, okay? 70 billion model, you probably will cost about $500,000 just to get the model out. If you're using AWS, like $4 per hour on the GPU usage. So it is expensive. And for your question about like embedding retrieval, right now have all those new vector databases, you probably just specifically designed for embedding based retrieval.
Yeah, and I'm not a panelist, but the question was about Metatron, so I'll answer. Again, Metatron is just our model. It's based on an open source, open access, large language model, and we trained it for medicine. For its 15 seconds of fame, before someone else replaces us, it is the best performing model for medicine. But what does that mean, right? It performs based on what? On clinical exam questions. And it goes to your second question about how to make sure that these are going down to zero, right? It needs to learn from clinicians. And so we're launching a massive online open validation and evaluation to make sure that we formalize the process of making it learn from clinicians. Because exam questions, everyone here who's a doctor, come on, like how many, like when you finished your exam questions, were you like ready for clinical practice? Certainly not. So same for Metatron. How much does it cost? Huge amounts of money. It took us to do that, 5-6 million on just the hardware, right? And then we had to train it for 12 days continuously. It's expensive, but when it's trained and you've got like a base, it's so important. Don't retrain the wheel, right? I mean, like it's if you keep it closed and it's not like Llama that's open, then you have to redo the entire process all over again, and it's just wasteful. So it's very cheap to actually fine tune and just update the last bits of it, or do reinforcement learning by human feedback. Very cheap. So there are ways to do it, but we need to release the models to enable it. Were there any other anyone else who wants to answer something? Okay, yes, please.
I do want to respond to this comment of zero errors.
Yeah, can't.
I don't actually agree with that concept. I just don't think that's a reasonable thing. This is very much the statistician perspective. I mean, I think if you have zero errors, the thought is you're overfitting your model and, that it's not really properly generalizing. I think that, I think people have to realize that these are fundamentally statistical models. And, there's always going to be this balance between, false positives, false negatives and whatnot, and realize that some small amount of error is true. And people, in our own neural networks, we make errors too. So, I'm not a fan of the zero error.
It doesn't exist. No, that like absolutist terms don't exist. And also, if we are transferring these into reality, we need to remember that reality is imperfect, and that we provide imperfect information to the models as well. So very important. And we also have to always calibrate it with the errors that humans have. I know we've got like a lineup here. Okay, make yourselves comfortable because I want to ask one question, right? Because we want to also change it. We've kind of spoken about education. We've spoken about skill atrophy, cognitive atrophy. I just want to get the conversation started with the second topic of basic science and try to be uplifting, right? Because the next question is going to be like really depressing. So the next question is going to be all about, the risks and everything. So for this one, I'd like to ask any of you if you can kind of, what was the most interesting and greatest achievement in basic science for generative AI? Anyone can answer. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, looks like go for it.
Sure. Well, obviously, I'm in the a little bit of the molecular domain, and what I've been really impressed with just in the last year or two is these models that generate structures and new drugs and so forth. These are often what they call the diffusion-based models. And I think what's so impressive about them is, in a sense, when you see ChatGPT generate text, well, a human could also generate text if you give them more time. But there's no way that a human can generate, a large, complicated three-dimensional structure. It's just impossible for a person to. This is something that people cannot do. And so I think it is very impressive to see a machine do this and do it in a kind of effective way.
Well, maybe you have something else?
I totally agree with Mark. I'm not doing much basic science. We are more on the machine learning models. I think from the clinical application perspective, all the progress on the NLP, on the imaging data processing, genomic data processing are exciting. Especially for things like Mark mentioned, for human may take a longer time to discover something new, like a drug discovery. I saw a paper on like an in silico drug discovery using large language model, shortened the development time from, I don't know, months or years to like 21 days. They come up a promising drug candidate, which I think is fascinating.
So.
Again, I'm farther still from basic science, but I would still position that the idea of drug discovery, molecular biology, and the ability to like translate them aggressively is important. The other aspect that people may not have seen as much is there were never enough genomic signatures identifiable on imaging before. And now you are seeing increasingly applications where people are taking imaging data or other information available and identifying people who may be high genetic risk individuals. So now allowing us to like do targeted genomics, targeted molecular phenotyping, which was not previously possible. And I think that's actually the domain where clinical and basic science like become more, the translational aspect becomes even more prominent.
Okay, good. So I think we're going to go back to the questions before they get very cranky. You've been waiting there. So we'll go to the next one, please. Welcome.
Patience, no worries.
Come close to the microphone so we can hear you.
No worries, I got a lot of patience. I'm a clinical informatics fellow. I'm an internal medicine physician at background. So I'm going to ask a question pertinent to the previous one. As AI is new to me, I'm learning how to do it. But one of the questions that I always get asked people around, where do we start? Like training data, like the training data that we have is so poor, so like, for example, the EPIC, like which is the one most accessible, obviously bias and all that. I understand the idea of we have to clean it up and make it better, but at starting point, how do we get like young researchers? Is there any other better resources? One, and more an ethical question, why do we hold AI to be more to higher standards than us? We always write papers about to err is okay, to err is human, but we hold AI to a much higher standard. So
Okay, so two very interesting questions. Let's start with the data. Okay, who wants to take that one?
I can start. I think it's paramount importance to like know what inputs are. The idea of foundation models and building non-overfit foundation models allows us to now use better curated data sets, smaller curated data sets that are well-defined with well-labeled. So the example I would say is ChatGPT. Everybody talks about ChatGPT being mass language model trained. The idea that it was trained on a series of texts all across the internet, where you hide a word and let the model predict it. But the majority of the gain that came in ChatGPT came from the question answers done by humans, where humans actually tuned and created a very well-curated set of questions. That was a minority of the entire information. And then there are some, again, it's not published evidence, but there is a lot of discussion on panels such as these, but that was the biggest driver to the success. The investment in human capital to create well-labeled quality question answer sets. That's why it's so natural when we communicate. The entire internet doesn't make it question answer ready. It's that extra layer that goes in. So I think that's similar to a medical domain too.
Yeah, and let's go to the next question about the. No, if you want to continue with that, that'd be great. Yeah.
I'll just give rejoinder. I mean, I do think what this question underscores, which is really important, is the data is so important, right? I mean, more and more, people use the phrase data is the new oil. I mean, I do think this is very true. And having good data is obviously the most important thing to training a good model. It's obvious. But it's actually hard to get good data, and there's a lot of barriers to that. I mean, it's obviously expensive, but also I think people have to think a lot about the degree to which data sets are really being put out for people to use, and or made available. And there's a lot of data that's not made available, and also there's a major, obviously in the biomedical domain, there's a major privacy issue with large amounts of data being made available too, and we have to kind of think about all those things.
And
I can also just add one comment, just echo Rohan's point. So we talked about there's two stages actually to train those models. One is on the pre-training. You just give the text without label, right? The other one is more kind of labeled, kind of fine-tuning. And high quality question answering pair is really important for ChatGPT's performance. In the first step of pre-training, because it's unsupervised learning, the data quality may be less important, but I would say it's also kind of important in some way, because if you have good like a texture data, the generated text will look nice too, because you see the lawsuit about New York Times, right? Because ChatGPT using New York Times articles in their first pre-training step. Those are very good writings, and it's important for the model too. Yeah.
Yeah, the model does need to learn how to speak in terms of syntax. So you need like a lot of that, but you also need very high quality information. It's not just hallucination, it's contamination. Hallucination is making up new stuff that's not supposed to be there, but contamination from that.
And this is like a science article shared by our team just in the last 24 hours. So I don't know how ethical this is. I haven't read the full article because I need to figure out the ethics. They took a baby at age 8 months and mounted a camera on top and recorded the voice of the baby with the visual cues. With one kid able to train a full language conversant model based on the input, because the video and the text were happening simultaneously. And the early phonation of the kid, when the kid's learning to talk, was used in one kid to develop a very high functioning language training architecture. So I do not condone that. I do not know what the ethics of that, who are the parents, I don't know. But I have to mention that this tells us that small amounts of very highly curated data might be instrumental in transforming how we do this, and may not be worrisome about gathering large amounts of high quality data.
Okay, let's go to the next question. We didn't address the second one, but let's try to get through this.
Okay. Hi, my name's Jim Duncan. I'm here in biomedical engineering and in radiology in the med school. So I've been doing computer vision. So I'm going to ask the curmudgeonly question, I guess, Mark, and others. So I mean, I've been doing computer vision and image processing and pattern recognition work for probably 40 years. I've been through at least 3 waves of AI. The first few crashed and burned. It's a lot of exciting stuff going on these days. But I guess my question is, you know, a lot of the problems, including ones we heard from this morning, are kind of classical problems in many ways about learning features, understanding information, predicting outcomes. And this, I mean, a lot of this is based in mathematics and physics and statistics. But now you can download code and make it do all kinds of fun things. So how do we draw the line? Because I think we tend to want to download tons and tons of data and learn new things. But if we just sort of frame the problem and said, we really understand this much, let's organize the data this way, let's apply some classical mathematics, and now maybe we put the data-driven learning on some hard problems. But I feel sometimes we're losing that. We're just, and especially as it gets out into the user community and the applications community. And so anyway, and in addition, you know, sort of on the end of that, like, you know, if we rename the symposium the Pattern Recognition Symposium or the Statistical Decision-Making Symposium, maybe we would have only gotten 200 instead of 600 applicants. I don't know. But anyway.
Okay, so who wants to take this one? Where do we draw the line with the classical methods and the new ones that are emerging at scale? Go for it, Mark.
I'm going to answer, Jim. So I think that's a great question, Jim. And there's a few things. I mean, obviously, you've probably heard of this, or many of the audience has. So there's this concept of interpretable AI. I mean, I think, you know, that it's very, even if the AI does very well, first of all, it's really important to actually understand it. And understanding it really means bringing it back to those principles that we actually understand as human beings. And that means classical physical laws, classical statistics, stuff like that. And so I fundamentally think that's very important, particularly in the biomedical domain where you're, you know, treating patients, creating drugs, things like that. You really need to understand them on the basis of real principles. And so I agree very much with Jim that that is a very, very important thing, and we have to think about that.
I just want to add a comment. I think this is actually really goes back to our first question. What is generative AI? Because AI versus generative AI, I think AI is very broad, right? Like you said, all the way go back when we do traditional, we can't call it AI methods because pattern analysis, right? Machine learning. But this wave of generative AI, I think it's different from what we have before based on a few things we talked about. It's focusing on the generation task. And it turns out this generation task models built on those generation tasks actually can be used for all other predictive model as well. So make it more kind of generalizable. A single model address a lot of things, and this intuitive way for human and this model to interact, and also the complexity of this model. I think this is a big difference of generative AI versus the traditional or previous AI effort. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's like a terrific question for a couple of reasons. One, I would say that it actually underscores the point about like folks who are doing fundamental discoveries in biomedical imaging, like new imaging technologies, need to understand the physical parameters and the mathematical principles behind generating the video that you put a deep learning model on, and that cannot be taken away by the fact that there's something like this exists. But the hope would be that these modeling strategies would enhance the capacity of experts who do statistical thinking to think fast, to be able to move faster in their processing and thinking. So I feel it helps ensure that. Second, I'd say if the goal is end user application, like the application shown today, which are like, I would say superficial in their nature, like they have a task, they have an outcome, and they're superficial. I think because of the rapidity, the point that Hua was raising, a company goes from having an idea to a product in 4 months. There'll have to be but at the cost of scalability for infrastructure. There'll have to be a non-inferiority type of assessment. Like we have to do statistical thinking, and what does it get us? It gets us maybe smaller models that are more, easily deployable in machines, but at 1 year extra, 2 years extra, and we have to find that trade-off. Where does that trade-off exist? And that's how I think we will define which applications are worth using some generative AI for, and which might be core fundamental things that we just take our time to solve properly.
Talking about, need to know what the generative AI model is doing. So when you evolve shapes and things, but it has nothing to do with how it's really evolved. all of it, we need to think about it.
I have to say, I really agree. And how can we understand what's going on in the models? Interpretable AI is really important. You have to understand. It's the whole point of it is really understanding the mechanisms underneath it. And I think some of the arguments here that were raised were just that it's something that emerges at scale as well. And to kind of go into the next question on this, some things that more traditional models maybe have a certain targets of what they're trying to predict. But in generative AI, it's creative. And sometimes it can give us access to information that we weren't specifically seeking. Maybe it's a hallucination, but maybe it's just access to potentially dangerous information. And as I said before, we're going to go a little bit dark now, right? So we want to speak about the risks and address those because it's very important to also understand them so that we can approach the development ethically. So, some people are very worried about these technologies, the generative AI technologies, and some of them are also using words like catastrophic risk. It's basically, for example, let's say if you're talking with ChatGPT and now all of a sudden the friction is, there's no friction between you and very dangerous information, such as, the next recipe for the next pandemic, for example, right? And you theoretically go into your basement and then develop the next pandemic, let's say. So how do you feel about these kinds of examples, and especially in with the scope of like open sourcing or closed sourcing models? Do you think that this kind of risk, the kind of risks that can emerge, right? So the questions are, it's twofold. What do you think about the kinds of risks? What are the risks to you, the most important ones? And the second part of the question is, how do you think they should be regulated, or if they should be regulated, and especially with respect to open sourcing and closed sourcing? So let's just first do this one, and I'm sorry, just make yourself comfortable. I think this is going to be a long one. Go for it. Who wants to go? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is a big risk. I mean, obviously, Annie has really pointed out a lot the obvious ones. People developing I don't know, viruses, bioweapons, creating a nuclear bomb or something like that from talking to ChatGPT. And fundamentally, I think regulating it, what it really means is restricting the information. And we've always thought about this. I mean, we have high security clearances on various weapons types of secrets, bioweapon secrets. And I think this is just to some degree an extension, but I think that kind of ethically or practically, it's not good to have all the information out there. And, of course, a lot of people argue that it will get out there and, that this isn't really an effective way of doing things. But I do think that, I don't know, I don't think it's a good idea to put the anthrax sequence out there for anyone to, download and do what they want with. I think that we have to think about those things.
And Hua, I'd like Hua to go next, just because you and I both, we're benefiting greatly from Llama, right, being released from Meta. Meta took the quite extraordinary step to release this very expensive model. So what do you think? Yeah.
I think that's true. Definitely, there's a big risk. I mean, for all this new AI technology, may generate wrong information, misinformation, cause a lot of problems. Some regulation definitely needed. But I also think the fear, for example, robots can take over the world and things like that. It's probably have two different type of fear. Like one is people who don't know how AI works and they see all the reports, then they worry. But then that's why I think the open source package is important, because it's really allow us to learn like how this whole large language model works. Based on my current knowledge, how we train the model, how we use the model for different applications, I don't have that much worry. But then I also don't know, because I feel like I still don't know a lot of things within this whole new technology, honestly. Because there are those top AI research like Hinton also worried a lot. So there might be something we don't know. They see in Google, they see OpenAI, we don't see it. So that's why I think if it's open source, we can, I mean, a lot of more research can learn this new technology, and maybe we have better assessment, like, is this really something we all need to worry about immediately versus
And I'm also here to translate something. So he mentioned Hinton. This is one of the quote unquote godfathers of AI, and there's a lot of disagreement between these godfathers of AI. Geoffrey Hinton being one of them, who's much more on the cautious side, and knowing. Yeah, and then you've got Jan LeCun, who released Llama, and who is much more on the side of like saying, well, open sourcing will allow us to actually, relating to the previous question, better investigate the models and understand how they work, so that you can design kind of safety measures for them. So those are the arguments. I don't know, Rohan, do you have something else to add to that one?
I mean, I would actually echo Mark's point, and is that the idea of having nefarious activities being associated with technology is not novel. Like when the World Wide Web came out, there still currently is a dark web, which is the idea that all information on nuclear bombs and stuff is accessible on the internet. Can the average person access it? No. Can it still be accessible? Yes. So I think the idea is that having some discussion and conversations like where we draw the line, and then ensuring, because these are interpretable models, if somebody generates a nuclear bomb signature, that can be blocked at source. ChatGPT saying, you just generated a nuclear generation strategy. Unfortunately, that's out of our bounds. So that cannot be generated. I think it's doable because it's so interpretable, because I think it actually helps us think about how do we create these infrastructural investments by having a conversation of what's okay and what's not.
Yeah, and I think you can definitely imagine that to do something really bad at scale, normally you need to have power, you need to have a lot of time, right? You need to have a lot of it, like education, etc. And this has lowered the barrier, you could say, to accessing this information. But if we at least understand how the tools work, maybe we can resist them, if that's what I kind of distilled from the conversation. Let's go back to the questions. Please go ahead.
So actually, I think my question perfectly builds off the safety discussion that we just had. With the advances and successes of ChatGPT and generative AI technology and a lot of the patient-facing domains, like you mentioned, with people finding ChatGPT responses more empathetic than some clinician ones, people having successes with diagnosing rare diseases or finding diagnoses that they weren't able to after years of consulting specialists. And then recently a study like being published saying that they conducted the first truly informed consent study where the individuals had access to a chatbot explaining the full criteria of the research study. Do you think that there's any like potential risks from the patient side of things with exposing them to this generative AI technologies? Are there going to be any more like novel issues that clinicians will have to face, or are there going to be any like infrastructure changes to like the EHR systems where patients will now be able to have live chats with their data and have more like better explanations of their conditions?
Okay, so I like this. But by the way, now we're in the last section, so this will be. Thank you very much for introducing it. Clinical practice, please.
No, I think that's a terrific question. I'd say one thing about all these examples, there's a lot of reporting bias involved, right? If ChatGPT was worse at empathy than clinicians, would you see a new JAMA article about it, JAMA Internal Medicine article about it? No, you would not see an article about that. And similarly, if it was found that it was not able to solve a rare case condition, would you know about it? For every one rare case it solves, probably didn't solve 10,000 that people put in their symptoms and were given like not useful information. So I think there is a little bit of like, only stuff that that's positive gets reported. So we are farther off than we might be based on just these isolated examples. And to your second point about like patient empowerment, there's just so many examples where I think there is a role there. We speak in so much jargon. It's impossible for people to understand what the clinicians speak. Scientists are also very prone to this. For us to now accessibly break down science for my level of understanding is just phenomenal, right? So understand, hey, what did my doctor actually mean when they said I have X? And I think there is some work that we're trying to do as a demonstration project on synthesizing published clinical research for patients and then assessing them on patient knowledge-based tools and how accessible the information is. It's clearly much better than us summarizing and synthesizing science.
I just want to add to that, just from the low resource setting component, like when you're speaking with patients in very low resource settings with like very low health literacy, the technological gap is massive. And I really think some of the biggest impact can be to translate that sort of information to those places. And I would just I put a plug in there as well for the open sourcing, that the positive part of potentially open sourcing things. In low resource settings, if you have to go and retrain the wheel and you have to like train your own llama in a low resource setting, that it's so that the barrier is so high because you don't have the money, it can't be done. And then what happens is you start to have unrepresentative technology. And so the impact that you wanted to have with patients, for example, will be very skewed towards those that are represented in the technology. So very important to make the technology accessible so that it's represented. Anyone else want to address this interesting question? Yeah.
One thing I will say, when I'm not a clinician, but when I think about AI being moved to a more patient-oriented or people-oriented setting, I do think that one thing that's important to realize is that the success we see with, say, translating languages, interpreting images, dealing with molecules, maybe doesn't translate the same way to human decisions. I'm not sure AIs are that good at modeling human decision makings. And one thing I put out there, I always like to say, is there's so much success in predicting things with AIs, but they can't seem to predict the presidential elections, or they can't predict any of these things. When it comes to people making decisions and people's judgment, I'm not so sure they're that good.
Just add on what Mark just said. I think we see a lot of individual examples of success or for a specific task, high performance. But it's probably our role, basically really do more solid validation. I saw there's a JAMA article on using ChatGPT to really diagnose those complex diseases, and the performance is about 40%. But then you see from news, like it looks like ChatGPT can handle all the rare disease cases and all those things. So I think that's a perfect example of how us, like a medical informatician, or we can do to validate this. Yeah.
And there was actually just, I liked Rohan's points, like you never hear about the failures. And I saw one article the other day, and the title was, I think it was like, ChatGPT neglects a neglected disease. So there was one article that I've seen on that topic. So, all right. And another question, or?
Thank you.
Okay, please. And we've got time for other questions, so please come up. We've got 4 minutes, so please come up for others. Yeah.
All right, thank you. My name is Joseph Valevsky, and I'm a post-baccalaureate researcher in the Hafler Lab who double majored in biochemistry and computer science. And so basically, I can think of, in addition to the limitations on AI and its improvement that we've already discussed, a couple other potential limitations, including the fact that we are approaching the size of the smallest possible transistor, limiting the efficiency of computer hardware. And additionally, even though more and more data may come out, it coming out actually at a faster pace than our ability to verify it may actually result in a decrease in performance, especially when we then may be tempted to use other AI to verify AI output. And I know that also currently leads to worse performance. So I was essentially wondering if you guys thought that these limitations were indeed legitimate constraints on the field right now, and what improvement we can expect reasonably.
Yeah, so I'll just some words that are just some nice phrases to use in this setting when you're speaking about like using AI to evaluate AI and using AI generated data to generate our new models as well. The snake is eating its tail, and there was a nice paper, if anyone wants to read about it. It was called Artificial Intelligence, and it was about this problem of the risk of recursion, where you just kind of like degenerate because you are not learning on proper data. But more to the general question, who wants to answer this one? Yeah, go for it, Mark.
I know I'm very interested in that. I mean, one thing that relates to is just the notion of how these technologies scale. I mean, one of the things that I think has really been exciting about just computation in biomedicine is that, computers have scaled exponentially for 30 years, which is really amazing. And, that's the Moore's law. And we also have obviously the next gen sequencing with the collection of large amounts of data. And I am doubtful that AI can scale exponentially that way for very long, just because of the sheer limitations, the amount of data, and the sheer size of these things. I might be wrong, and you should probably quote me and I'll see if I'm wrong in a couple of years. But I do agree with you. I think that it will not be able to continue to scale.
We are going to make predictions for the last few minutes, so I'll let you be the first one. But there is something just to add on to that. The theme of like we're running out of data. So there have been some papers on predictions about how data is scaling with how compute is scaling, and how those two kind of things are not meeting perfectly, and that we're running out of quote unquote data. So especially stuff that's accessible. So very important to make data more accessible. Who else wants to answer this question? Yeah. You can speak anything that inspired you from this guy's question.
I think, I mean, I would say I would agree that there is probably a ceiling on a short-term ceiling on our computational capacity that would, in the short term, reduce the escape velocity that we've been on. But I would point out to the other fact there are today, if you saw examples, we're like barely scratching the surface on applying our existing technology for many domains that are important, like science and clinical medicine. And maybe the time we'll gain from not exponentially spending on infrastructure development will be spent on like dissemination, validation, application development. And I think that might be sufficient as an outcome. And that's my prediction too. We'll do more of that.
Okay, well, we're going to have some more specific predictions. The last three, we've only got a minute left. So we're going to have quick predictions on each of the themes, right? So let's start with medical education, and you're going to fill in the rest of I'll start with you, Mark. So going to fill in the rest of the question. It's like in 5 years, right? Generative AI for medical education will blank.
Sure. Well, I definitely think, as we've all heard earlier today, I think it's going to certainly transform the way we code in basic science and how we deal with large and also simple data sets. I think more and more people are just going to use AI, not so much to code, but just to help interpret their data sets and access data. I think that's going to be something we're going to see. I think the other thing that we might see too is I do think it might change a little bit about how we do education in the future. I mean, I think there's even these wild notions I've heard about. We're not going to write books anymore. We're going to train a very big model, and then we're going to talk to those models after they've been trained. But I think that this kind of conversational way of extracting information, I do think we're going to see very much. And one final thing I'll say in relation to that, which kind of contradicts the last point I had, is one really impressive things these models have done is they can train themselves. I mean, one of the amazing things that I think we saw a few years ago was Google, not only did they have their DeepMind thing figure out how to win and go, but they figured out how to actually have two of them kind of compete with each other and kind of train each other. And I do think watching the AIs kind of converse with each other is going to help us a lot in thinking about how to educate people and how to get information out.
Okay, so the next one, the next prediction is going to be on basic science. That's going to be Hua, and also fill in that blank in the next 5 years.
What about the technology large language model? What I can say, I don't think I can make any prediction for 5 years, not even for a year, because just based on my own experience, what I'm doing last year or what I learned last year versus what I'm now a year later is very different. Yeah. And there's a large language model, different type of things come up almost every week. Yeah.
I would really agree though. Like it's very, very tiring to keep up. Yeah. So yeah, not even next week. I won't guess. And Rohan, for clinical practice.
I think because clinical practice moves at a slower pace, it is predictable. So we don't change quickly along the time. So we'll have more, approved software as a medical device powered by AI, informing care and improving healthcare, and mostly valid technologies. And I think that's where we'll go in the next 5 years.
Okay, so you heard it from them. No apocalypse. We're going to survive. So with that, I think we can enjoy our coffee. And thank you very much.